When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject: The Wild. User: GLTT. Posted August 18th, 1998.
Maybe if I wasn't so tired or I hadn't driven this road so many times, I'd have appreciated the view more. Even with the moon hidden behind clouds, there's a certain majesty to driving alone through frost-covered fields on a glossy ribbon of blacktop. My problem was that I'd been up since 6 a.m., made the 5-hour return trip to Chicago for a supervised visit with my kids, then fought with my ex and her fucking lawyer for no other reason than they knew it would wear me out. To make it all worse, the only thing I had to look forward to in the morning was another day of work. My shoulders ached at the thought. Living in Indiana had always been my ex's idea. Trudy and I met in design school, and from the way she dressed, shot whiskey, and swore like a landlocked sailor, you wouldn't have guessed she was a rich kid. The dashboard clock on my crumbling Tempo said it was 10 p.m. as I sped through ice-cold farmland. Open fields were gradually being clotted up by stands of heavy, dark trees, drawing shadows around them like a cloak. It was becoming so thick that my headlights seemed dimmer. I shook my head and kept my eyes on the road, remembering back to that night when my life changed forever. For a year, True had waved off any question about her background more in depth than where are you from, until the night when, without any warning or preamble, she let me in. It was Valentine's Day. We were too broke, or at least I was, to pay the overinflated restaurant prices, so we drank wine and celebrated together, eventually ending up naked and exhausted under a heavy blanket on the floor of my cramped apartment. Out of nowhere, True told me that there was something she hadn't been honest about, and I thought she was going to tell me she had a kid or something. There was no way I could have guessed that she was about to tell me she'd given our school and me a fake last name because her real one was too recognizable. Recognizable is putting it mildly. When she told me who she really was, I felt a rush of hot blood flood to my face. Even a lowly art major knew her family. It knew they were from the kind of money that hid behind stone walls and tinted windows while controlling vast chunks of the Midwest, from Chicago to Midland. I felt a momentary panic at the irrational thought that enforcers in black suits were about to kick down my door and cave in my skull for some of the things True and I had done on the floor over the last year. But no one broke down the door. Instead, she told me everything about her life that had been held back. True said she was done with them, their control, their power over every part of her life. Their theatrics, she said, were the only thing worse than the subtle social pressures they placed on her. The expectation that she live up to the family name by attending events where their kind of people can see and be seen. Going to design college instead of the same Ivy League hellholes that had educated her parents and siblings had been her first stab at independence. Looking back, I suppose fucking a middling talented graphic designer had been her second. At the time, all I could think was that I loved her and wanted to protect her however I could. Even years later, after everything, I was still filled with an infuriating warmth when I thought about how she felt pressed against me in that moment. As shadows gathered around my car, it was all too easy to think this was some nightmare that would soon draw to a close, and I'd wake up back under that blanket with the woman I loved, that she hadn't turned into a stranger who looked at me with unearned disgust. True wanted to get away from it all, especially from the city where her family had people everywhere. The simple life appealed to her: kids, dogs, a farmhouse on some land outside a small town where everyone knew your name. I'd never imagined myself as a father, but looking into those big green eyes, I was only too happy to agree. The more she described her dream, the more my heart swelled as I imagined myself at the center of it. The two of us holding hands and growing old together on a porch swing. The next day, I quit my program, and within a month, we were renting a house outside Elkhart, Indiana. Our first son, Lane, arrived 8 months later. He was 2 when his brother Ian was born. Even though I hadn't finished my degree, what little I had learned made it slightly easier for me to find work in a furniture shop. Even if it wasn't the Chicago or Midland graphic design firm I'd envisioned, it meant I got to come home to my beautiful wife and family. When True began to grow distant in the months after Ian was born, I chalked it up to postpartum and did what I could to bridge the gap. Still, no matter how far I extended the olive branch, how much of the household load I took on in addition to work, she continued to withdraw, becoming icy and cutting. Some days, I hardly recognized her. I came home on a Wednesday night to find her car gone from the driveway and the house quiet. A curt note on the kitchen table filled in the rest. True had had enough of our pitiful, small life and taken the boys back to her family. I didn't know what to do, so I sat on the cold porch swing until dawn. The months that followed were a blur. Phone calls with lawyers I couldn't afford who told me that the legal might of her family was such that I'd have better luck faking my own death and starting again in Costa Rica than I would fighting back. There was no hope of getting the boys full-time. At best, I could have bi-weekly supervised visitations on Sunday, no doubt chosen because True knew I worked Monday, and this would be maximally inconvenient. I was drawn out of my reflection by the realization that the odometer on my dash wasn't moving. No matter how much further my headlights carved into the darkness, which had settled on the countryside, the Odo's digits refused to move. I snorted. It seemed appropriate. True would say I'd killed it inside by trying to make it live a life it never really wanted. When she declared that to me in a custody hearing, wearing a tailored gray suit, her hair expertly styled, it cut in to the deepest part of me. She'd been the one who'd wanted to move to the sticks, to get away. I said that at the time, and the little flicker it caused in her big green eyes, a flash of sadness and regret before indignity slammed back into place, was the worst thing that could have happened to me. It put in me the thought that the woman I loved was still somewhere in there. Was there, I wondered, some combination of words and circumstances that could bring her back out? The tempo sputtered, like the thought had strained its own credulity past the breaking point. Its engine strained even as acceleration slowed, headlights dimming. With one final emphatic pop, the car went dark, and having lost power steering, I wrestled the wheel until I coasted onto the gravel shoulder. It was deathly silent, inside the car and out. Even after having made this trip for several months, between losing the odometer and an unnatural darkness obscuring everything more than an arm's length away from the car, I had no idea where I was. How long had it been since I'd seen another car, I wondered. Long enough, I couldn't remember, though how long that had actually been was anyone's guess. I'd spent the entire drive so far up in my head that time had completely gotten away from me. It didn't take long for that time to catch up or the temperature inside the car to drop. I didn't have a cell phone, but I did have a winter emergency kit in my trunk. Steeling myself against what I knew was going to be biting cold, even compared to the inside of the car, I took a breath and pushed open my door. Whatever I'd steeled myself for, it wasn't enough. It was as if the shadows themselves emitted a deep freeze which seeped right through my clothes. Why was it so goddamn dark? I'd seen cloudy, moonless nights on this highway, just never like this. I drew my coat around me, shivering as I walked back to the Tempo's trunk. It popped open with a metallic groan. I reached inside for the heavy woolen blanket and chemical heating pads I kept in there for just such an occasion. As I wrapped the blanket around me, two sounds happened in quick succession. First, a crunching sound behind me, like movement across frozen ground. I stiffened and wheeled around to see something I could barely comprehend. A nude man, his body withered and gray, veins straining against paper-thin skin. Atop its heavily corded neck, a stag's head, its eye sockets empty yet somehow alive, leered at me. Before I could react, the second sound arrived, a deep rumbling which seemed to be coming from everywhere, as if the air itself were quaking. The abomination craned its terrible head skyward, and I followed it. Starting in the east, a line of fire seemed to burn its way across the entire night sky. The flame was so brilliant, I had to shade my eyes. Trailing behind it was something even more incomprehensible than the predatory creature in front of me, which was now cowering in fear, emitting an ear-splitting squeal. A line of black riders, distant and godlike, thundered overhead on horses whose hooves glowed with an unearthly blue light. The otherworldly gloom obscuring my view of the countryside seemed to be swept away by the horde's advance, leaving only the usual darkness of a winter night. The gnarled, eyeless thing which had frightened me earlier, only moments before, was now running away, its two long legs pumping determinedly in a doomed attempt to stay ahead of the celestial cavalry. Seconds later, it was blown away into the distance as if by a shockwave, and the apocalyptic show was over. Riders vanishing over the far horizon as if they'd never been there at all. Not long after that, a pair of headlights approached in the distance. All I could do was stand there, dumbly, draped in a heavy woolen blanket, and stick out my thumb.
Subject, Showtime. User, CinemaGuy78RP. Posted April 25, 1994.
I'm a movie guy, by which I mean I love movies. Watching them, talking about them, generally just being around them. Over the years, I've worked at a few of the theaters around Rochester, including some of the old classics like The Waring and The Coronet. I also worked at the Lyle, both before and after they started showing dirty movies to make ends meet. Boy, you better believe me when I say I have seen some stuff. Still, all the weirdos I used to meet at the Lyle and all the second-run horror flicks I used to watch at the Coronet are nothing compared to what happened on one of my last nights at the Stone Ridge Plaza. The Stone Ridge closed about 8 months ago, and it broke my heart. Not because it was particularly unique, because it wasn't, but because I worked with a good crew. I actually got to be a manager for about a year before they closed the doors, which was a first for me. Even though it was a triplex, the Stony was a low-budget affair. All we had for security was a baby monitor and a single cheap CCTV camera in the lobby. Most nights, it was just me and a projectionist working, so we had to divide up ticket and concession sales duties as best as we could before they went up to the booth. When the screenings were over, I'd make sure everyone got out, then go up to the office to count cash. The night this story happened, I was working with Tony, and we were showing I Know What You Did Last Summer, Kiss the Girls, and that Kevin Kline comedy In and Out, which is a scream. So if you haven't seen it, go rent it as soon as you can. And I mention that one specifically because, given what I'm about to tell you, you might think I was unduly influenced by the house playing a full slate of creepy movies. It was a busy night, with the last showing of Summer around midnight. Once everyone had skedaddled, it was 2 a.m. or thereabouts, and I hoofed it upstairs to get everything done so we could go home. I was midway through tallying up the receipts when I remembered I'd forgotten to count the stock in the concession stands. Thankfully, Tony was already on the lobby cam, standing behind register 1, so I buzzed him on the airphone and asked him to count the candy. I knew right away something was up because Tony is a high-energy guy even at that time of the night, but when I called down to him over the radio, he didn't move. He just kept staring at the floor. His face turned slightly away from me. I tried again and still got nothing. By this point, I was kind of annoyed because I almost never asked him to do anything outside the projection booth, and it was late, and the longer he spent staring into the middle distance, the longer it'd take us to get home. So I tried him one more time, giving him a little bit of tone, if you get my meaning. And the sharp tone got a response out of him. He looked up and toward the camera, then back at the floor. The quality of that closed caption camera was absolutely abysmal, so I couldn't really make out the look on his face, but his body language was definitely off. Can't even quite describe it, but it's kind of like he was a marionette whose strings had been cut. He was just kind of standing there, all slumped over. Obviously, this was getting me nowhere, so I finished counting cash, locked everything up, and took one final look at the CCTV before heading downstairs. Tony was still there, doing his weekend at Bernie's routine, and I was preparing a grouchy manager speech. Problem is, when I got downstairs, which took me seconds, he was gone. I tried calling his name, nada, so I figured he'd taken off to avoid having me chew him out, and fair enough, I'd have done the same. It took me a few minutes to count the stock and close house, after which I started to kill the lights. As I did, I heard Tony yelling that he was still up in the booth. I jogged up there to give him the gears. When I pushed open the door of the booth, Tony was rubbing his eyes. He apologized, said he'd fallen asleep during the final reel and had only just woken up. I stared at him long enough he got uncomfortable and asked me what my deal was. I sputtered for a second, and then said he couldn't have been asleep. I saw him on the lobby cam a minute ago. Told him he'd been standing around the register for 10 minutes, looking like the living dead. Tony went pale. He very quickly threw on his old bomber jacket, pushed past me, breaking into a trot the second he was out of the projection booth. Never being slow to catch a hint, I ran after him, killing the house lights along the way. I had to practically beg him to stay with me long enough to lock up the front doors. Afterward, we sat in Tony's van smoking a J. It took a while, but he finally said what we'd both been thinking. If that wasn't me in the lobby, man, who was it? And why did it want to look like me? I still don't have an answer.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.